Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome to the AVACGIS Center for Global Islamic Studies webinar series. So thank you for waiting. We will start shortly to let other people join. And my name is Aishanur. I am the program coordinator. The webinar today will be with Dr. Kameelah Rashad on holding onto the light of faith, Black Muslims coping with COVID-19, social unrest, and racial violence. And the webinar will be moderated by Dr. Ahmet Selim Tekeloğlu from the AVACGIS Center and the Meydan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ahmet Selim Tekeloğlu, and I'm a research fellow and editor-in-chief of Meydan. This is the Meydan.com at the AVACGIS Center for Global Islamic Studies at George Mason University. Thank you for joining us today for the sixth session of the center's webinar series on COVID-19 and Muslim religiosity. Professor Peter Mandeville, our director, has just posted the link to the series in the chat. And today we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Kameelah Rashad with the title, Holding On to the Light of Faith, Black Muslims Coping with COVID-19, Social Unrest and Racial Violence, where we'll be treated to a wonderful session with an utmost expert, and we'll talk on the Black COVID survey research project that Dr. Rashad has led. So a few announcements before we get started is if you have missed our previous webinars in this series, you can access them from the AVACGIS Center for Global Islamic Studies website. And the recordings of those sessions are also available at our Vimeo account. And my colleague Aisha Nursen Mascara will be posting those links, and she has already posted some of them. So a few administrative details. The center's program coordinator, our colleague Aisha Nursen Mascara, will be hosting and supporting the webinar on the back end. So she'll be posting reminders and links in the chat box. During the talk, we ask that all of our audience members kindly remain muted. And there will be a question and answer period after Dr. Kameelah finishes her presentation. And during this Q&A session, you can either raise your hand through the raise your hand feature, and we will ask you to unmute yourself to ask the question. So I will be reaching out to you in the order that we see the hands raised. And if you, of course, prefer to rather type your question in the chat box, we will also be conveying that to our presenter. So I hope that the process goes smoothly, and we are looking forward to that interaction. And I also wanted to let you know that this session, including the Q&A session, is being recorded, so that we can make it available through the center's website and social media accounts in about a week or so after the presentation. So we encourage you to visit our website, which is islamicstudiescenter.gmu.edu. And of course, to take a look at the Meydan, the center's public-facing digital scholarship platform at themeydan.com. So before I introduce our speaker, just a quick plug for our next session, which will be on September 8th with Gary Bunt from University of Wales, Trinity St. David. Gary Bunt's talk will be titled The Allah Algorithm, Interpreting Islamic Influencers' Online Responses to COVID-19. You can RSVP for this session through the link that Aishanur just posted in the chat. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kameelah Rashad, to you all. Dr. Rashad is currently an instructor and postdoctoral psychology resident at the Department of Counseling and Psychological Services at Westchester University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Rashad is also the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting healing and emotional well-being in the American Muslim community through dialogue, education, and training. She is also the founding co-director of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. This is an initiative launched in collaboration with Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative to address needs for effective planning, preparedness, and organizing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Rashad's clinical and research areas of interest include spirituality and psychotherapy, mental health, stigma in faith and minority communities, first-generation college students and emerging adults of color, diversity, religious identity, and multicultural issues in counseling, healing, justice, and faith-based activism. racial trauma and healing, and many other subjects that include questions around anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Blackness, Black Muslim psychology, and Black Muslim intersectional invisibility. Dr. Rashad graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a BA in psychology and Master of Education in Psychological Services. And she obtained further graduate education, earning a second master's in restorative practices and youth counseling from the International Institute for Restorative Practices. And she completed her doctorate in clinical psychology with a concentration in couple and family therapy at the Chestnut Hill College in Philadelphia. So it's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kameelah and Rashad to our session. This was a long introduction, but it's going to be worthwhile. Dr. Kameelah, thank you so much for joining. The floor is yours.
Sure. Okay. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you for the invitation to share this important work. My hope is that while some of the information that I'm going to convey is very heavy, I mean, we're living in a really challenging time, and it is important for us to understand the experiences of American Muslims, and so that we know how to act, right? What we need to be mindful of, how we can be of support to one another, and in all of our different ways, how we can advocate for justice. You know, that is the bottom line. And so I will be sharing my screen with some background information and also some recommendations for steps forward. So if you give me 1 second. Okay. So again, as Brother Ahmed mentioned, I am the founding co-director of the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition and the founder and president of Muslim Wellness Foundation. And the reason why this work was incredibly important, we established the coalition at the beginning of March, is because Black Muslims sort of sit at this very unique intersection. And I'm sure many of you are familiar or have heard the term intersectionality. It's used quite a bit. Unfortunately, folks don't always understand exactly what it means, but you know, understanding the impact of multiple marginalized identities on that person's lived experience and focusing not simply on the aspects of oppression, but also strength and resilience, so that we have an idea of the whole person. And with the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak and COVID pandemic, what we saw happening was that there was a lot of attention being paid to how it was impacting the African American community, and efforts within the Muslim community, like the National Muslim Task Force, to understand the impact on American Muslims. However, for African or Black Muslims who are sitting at the intersection of both communities, there are going to be unique impacts, concerns, needs, and also resources. And so part of what I hope to share with you today is to deepen your understanding of Black or African American Muslims, and also why is it important for all American Muslims to understand why, when we're advocating for Black Lives Matter, when we're advocating for political engagement, civic engagement, that it is for the benefit of every Muslim, every human being, to understand these issues. So bismillah. So the teacher in me needs an agenda, so at least you're aware of what to expect, in this conversation. So very briefly, an overview of who Black Muslims are and the context, to understand what's called social toxicity. And that is going to be the different factors impacting the lives of Black Muslims in the US. The National Black Muslim COVID Coalition and the Black COVID Survey Project, which was a collaboration between Muslim Wellness Foundation and the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I served as the principal investigator on that study, and what we found was both sobering and inspiring, and so I'm hoping to share a little bit about that, and inshallah we'll have time for questions. So first, again, the information may not be new to some, but it may be new to others. And I think it's important to explain who Black Muslims are, and also for people to see pictures of us. Because if you did a quick Google search of American Muslims, I'm almost certain, if the algorithm hasn't changed, that you will find very little pictures of folks who look like me. And so when I do my best to sort of represent my community, it is for you to also see us, to be able to put a face to the different communities that live in the US. So according to the 2017 ISPU survey, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, 1 in 4 American Muslims identify as Black or African American. This is a significant number of American Muslims in this country. Again, unfortunately, representation, leadership, conversations doesn't always, and unfortunately, often do not represent the majority of community members, and certainly not representative of the racial and ethnic diversity of the community as well. So again, this little Black Muslim happens to be my son. His name is Ismail. And what we know to be true about Black Muslims is that this is, Black Muslims have been present in the United States for quite some time, for hundreds of years. And there are estimates by historians that about 1/3 of enslaved Africans were Muslim. And today, Black Muslims are comprised of US-born descendants of enslaved Africans in the US and Caribbean, a group I happen to be descended from, and as well as immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean. 63% of US-born Muslims are convert to Islam. So again, significant majority of the overall Muslim community, significant majority of converts to Islam in the US are African American. So I want to explain intersectional invisibility because it'll help sort of ground everything that I'm sharing within a particular context. And so intersectional invisibility essentially focuses on understanding how those with marginalized or minoritized identities within a minority group are often invisible, right? And so American Muslims are a religious minority, but within that religious minority community, African Americans tend to be marginalized as well as a racial minority, although we happen to represent close to a significant majority of American Muslims. And so there's a distortion, right, that often pictures, conversations aren't representative of that racial and ethnic diversity. And so it contributes to what these researchers call acute social invisibility, which means that not only are you sort of isolated or excluded or pushed to the margins of one minority group, but the other as well. And I'll show you what this means. This is how I've represented Black Muslim intersectional invisibility. I'm a visual person. Sometimes it helps to have an image that sort of captures this concept. And so on the left, what you see here is that when people tend to think of Black, if I asked you right now, what is the first thing that came to mind if I said African American, if I said Black? Would you, in your mind, be envisioning someone who's Muslim? Right? Odds are probably not. And so this idea is that all Black or African Americans are Christian. So there's a universality of Christianity, and there's Christian privilege or hegemony, right? So that, and this often goes hand in hand with white supremacy, that there's an assumption that others of different spiritual or religious orientations are not part of the American conversation. And then on the right, again, through propaganda, through a variety of different reasons, American Muslim becomes associated with the Arab and South Asian community. So that Muslim is someone who is foreign, who's immigrant, who's brown, who doesn't speak English. And again, this is a misrepresentation of our community. And so within this paradigm, Black Muslim intersectional invisibility, Black Muslims are not considered, right, typical members of the American Muslim community, and they're not considered typical members of the Black community because of Christian privilege. And so just remember, if we're talking about Black Muslim intersectional invisibility, right, being marginalized within a marginalized group, this idea of social toxicity then helps us begin to understand the vulnerabilities that Black Muslims face because of that acute social invisibility and also oppression as a result of being a racial and religious minority. So social toxicity refers to essentially what are the, when we think of physical health, the toxins in an environment, right? We think about polluted air, air quality, we think about the quality of water, right, of natural resources. And so social toxicity refers to the extent to which the social environment in which individuals grow and develop is poisonous, right? What are serious threats to the development of a positive identity, of success in school, family, work, and the community? So we want to understand what are the social and cultural poisons that Black Muslims face as a result of being both a religious and racial minority. And here are just a few. This is not an exhaustive list. This doesn't cover everything, but I think it does capture some of the major factors or stressors that Black Muslims face presently, historically, and without significant intervention and action, these are also the toxins that Black Muslims will face in the future. So I'm not going to go through each one, but understanding white supremacy and capitalism, anti-Muslim bigotry and violence. Others may refer to this as Islamophobia, but that term tends to be so vague as to, kind of obscure, again, the impact on people's everyday lives. So when we talk about anti-Muslim bigotry and violence, I think this gives us a deeper understanding of what it means to hate or discriminate against someone simply because they're Muslim. Anti-Black racism, and this is anti-Blackness that occurs within broader American society and also within the American Ummah. Racial trauma and violence, be that historical, intergenerational. It can include a concept called racial battle fatigue, right? Constantly being hypervigilant about experiences connected to race and racial identity, and also race-based traumatic stress. And finally, this idea of Christian hegemony, right? Christian privilege, religious microaggressions that Black Muslims face, again, in the broader society, but also religious microaggressions that Black Muslims we might face within the Black or African American community. So I want to show you a series of pictures and headlines to, again, help us explore what these toxins look like, right? Again, it's a lot of words on a page, a lot of new terms perhaps, like Black Muslim intersectional invisibility, but I want to show you what this means. And this was in the 2016 presidential election, one of the sort of, again, social commentary around, again, this is depicting a Black Muslim woman, how Black Muslim women were really facing both racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, gendered Islamophobia, right? So the specific experiences of women who are visibly Muslim from the highest office, right? From those who are running to be president, those who are running for other political offices, really being on the receiving end of that toxicity. This was taken in about 2017 in Texas. There were masked, armed, it's an open carry state, armed individuals standing outside of a mosque. And this picture of this African-American Muslim woman has kind of captivated me for years. For someone to have to walk past, right? This is just one individual holding the gun, but to walk past that level of intimidation, that level of violence, right? To enter into your house of worship. She seems completely unbothered. I don't know what's going through her mind, what she's feeling in the moment. Perhaps she is very scared, in fear of her life. But what we see here is someone who is going to enter into their house of worship with confidence. This is Osama Rahim. He was murdered in Boston in June of 2015. And much of the sort of social media commentary, public commentary, really highlighted, again, both the racism and the anti-Muslim bigotry, right? With a name like Osama Rahim, right, someone tweeted, no wonder he was killed, right? Or he looks like a thug, right? He looks like someone who is up to no good. These are the things that are being said of this Black Muslim man who was murdered. Robert Doggard was convicted. This is a community, a predominantly African-American community in Islamburg, New York, upstate New York, that repeatedly received threats and plans of attacks on this community. Again, these are the children that live there. There was another planned attack about 2 or 3 years later, and this plot was disrupted by a student. These 3 men are seniors in high school, right? This is January 2019. These 3 men, seniors in high school, it was another student that overheard their conversation and told another adult. That's what sort of intervened in that moment, but they had plans to attack this very community. Dominique Ray, this is from February of last year, was a Muslim inmate who was denied by officials, denied access to conversations and to just be with his imam before his execution. And this was in Alabama. This is of, his name was Ben Kita, of a family in Washington in 2017, who found their son. He was missing for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then his body was found hanging from a tree. More recently, what we have discovered, or what has been publicized, is video footage of a Black Muslim man who also died as a result of injuries that he sustained by an officer with his knee, like pressing his knee on his neck. And what the recording of this video shows is that Muhammad Jr. Was calling on Allah. Right, in his last few minutes, he said he couldn't breathe. Perhaps he, at that moment, knew that his death was imminent, and he's calling on Allah. And the police officer said, Allah, he's not going to help you right now. And unfortunately and tragically, in the beginning of this month of August, a family of 5 was killed as a result of arson in Denver, Colorado. Everyone who has spoken of this family, very young family, this tragedy hits close to home, right? And so all of the headlines, the images that I've shown speak to, again, that social toxicity, right, of arson, of unfair treatment while incarcerated, of, mysterious, dying under mysterious circumstances when there's a history of lynching in this country. All of that contributes, right? And this is a picture taken from a protest in 2017 after the death of Ben Kita, that Black Muslim lives matter, right? And we often, again, in conversations about the importance of this movement, we must include Black Muslims, right, who are subject to the same types of injustices. Another, I think, important point to make is that Islamophobia is not the new Black. This was actually taken from an article that was written a couple years ago, because the anti-Black racism, white supremacy, and racial violence has not ended, right? So there is no new form that has sort of replaced this chronic, right, disease, this chronic problem in the United States. And again, Black Muslims are facing both that anti-Muslim violence and anti-Black racism, and really trying to figure out, right, how we protect ourselves, how we thrive, how we understand suffering and meaning within this context. I would say that, anti-Black, sentiment, as sort of part of white supremacy, part of capitalism, that anti-Muslim bigotry, Islamophobia, one, is not new, and it is a symptom of a problem of overall kind of global white supremacy. So I want to shift gears a little to understanding, again, what we're facing in this moment, right? So I depicted, headlines, pictures of what those social toxins are, right, for Black Muslims. Now enter into the picture COVID-19, a global pandemic in March, right? Not yet 6 months ago that we, started to see more states undergo lockdown, quarantine, social isolation. And so within sort of this context of social toxins with anti-Muslim violence, anti-racism, police brutality, incarceration and surveillance and monitoring of Black Muslims, we have a global pandemic, right? This is going to exacerbate the social toxicity that is already present. And so through APM Research Lab is really looking at deaths by race and ethnicity in the US, and the numbers should frighten everyone, right? The number of Black Americans who are dying, right? I'm speaking specifically here of Black Americans, should be horrifying, right? Should really cause everyone to sort of take a moment and to consider the implications, right? The repercussions of what this means. So Black and Indigenous Americans experiencing the highest death tolls due to COVID-19. And these numbers, I would say, don't capture the full picture, right? How many folks may have died, but hadn't been tested for COVID, right? So maybe that's not part of what what is written on the death certificate because there were maybe symptoms or illness, but COVID wasn't officially diagnosed. But this is also what the APM Research Lab says, that 1 in 1,125 Black Americans have died, right? Compared to 1 in almost 2,500 white Americans, right? Black Americans represent about 14 or 15% of the American population. The fact that we're dying at such a disproportionately high rate, right, is alarming, right? It should really kind of cause the hair in your arms to stand up because this is systemic, right? This is not sort of by coincidence. This is a result of systemic discrimination over time due to economic sort of injustice, health disparities, a number of different reasons. So Black Americans continue nationwide to experience high rates of infection and of death. And this, again, kind of grabbed my attention as particularly concerning, right? If Black Americans had died of COVID-19 at the same rate as white Americans, almost 20,000 Black people would still be alive. Right? I want to say that again. If Black Americans were dying at the same rate as white Americans, right? We're only 15% of the population in the United States. But if we had died at the same rate as white Americans, there would be almost 20,000 Black Americans still alive today, right? I just want to sit with that for a minute. When we're talking about the social toxins, anti-Black racism, police brutality, and we're talking about anti-Muslim violence, threats of lynching, right? Just this past weekend, we get news of Jacob Blake, who was shot 7 or 8 times, point blank range in the back, right? With his 3 children in his car. They were celebrating his son's 8th birthday. Another instance of police brutality, of subsequent protests, right, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and some surrounding cities. And this, again, many people that I talk to, Black Muslims, non-Muslim Black folks, a lot of people yesterday, right, as more news started to come out, this was Sunday evening, and then Monday, more news started to, one, be heard by mainstream media, more details of what happened. Very heavy, very heavy. I myself avoided even watching the news while I was at, during work hours, because I knew, even though I had already heard, right, some of the details, the video was being shared, CNN plays it without a trigger warning, right? And so to see on video just how precarious, right, Black life is, the threat of death, right, not just from COVID-19, but at the hands of law enforcement, right, can change in an instant, right? One instant, Jacob Blake is celebrating his son's birthday. And the next minute, he's in the intensive care unit. His father says that they now believe that his son, Jacob Blake, is paralyzed from the waist down, right? This is in an instant. Yesterday, I also sent my son off to soccer practice, called the Lyft to pick him up, and the Lyft was pulled over. He texts me, right, in the Lyft, and I'm following, through the app. It's pulled over, and he texts me, he said, "Mommy, my heart is racing so fast." And in that moment, I thought about whether that text from my son could be the last communication from him, right? If something happened in that interaction between the driver and the police officer who pulled that person over, would that text message with my son saying, "My heart is beating so fast," would that be the last communication? He told me he was on the phone with one of his best friends, and I thought about Trayvon Martin, who throughout that encounter was on the phone with one of his best friends. So these moments, these instances in which we are confronted with mortality, we are confronted with death, it impacts all of us, right? This is not something that simply occurred in Wisconsin, but is reverberating throughout the Black community and throughout the Black Muslim community as we speak. And so again, if we understand how detrimental and devastating these social toxins can be, we need to do something about it. We need to understand it deeply and then advocate for system change. One of the ways that we attempted to bring awareness, again, to this intersection, to the social toxins, is by forming the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition. What are the unique concerns of Black Muslims? One is that when we're looking at disproportionate high rates of death, and we're thinking about the time, right? We have 3 days to bury our loved ones. How is that being handled within a community that is seeing high rates of death, right? Within a week. I saw one statistic yesterday. They said the average death rate is about 1,000 now, just across the country. And so imagining, right, communities that are overwhelmed, right? Funeral homes, Muslim funeral homes that are overwhelmed by the numbers of people who are dying. When we're thinking about sending aid and relief to Black communities, right? Are we also paying attention to whether or not, if there's food shortages, right, for certain members of our communities? Are we making sure that those are at least, there are no pork options, right? And so these are some of the concerns that Black Muslims have as, again, we attempt, like many communities, to understand the impact of the pandemic. Through Muslim Wellness Foundation, in partnership with the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, conducted a national survey, right, to understand the impact. Through May and June, so about 4 or 5 week time span, how are people feeling? What are they thinking about in the areas of work, of family life, of their own sort of spiritual and mental well-being? We wanted to hear from Black Americans of all faiths. And this was the only, and has been, the only national survey to intentionally capture the religious diversity of our community. We collect data from about 850 self-identified Black or African Americans, and about a third were Muslim, a third Christian, and a third identified as other or either no affiliation. So again, being able to just take a quick snapshot to understand how people are coping, what they're experiencing, so that we can do a better job of advocating for these particular needs. So what I'm going to share with you is the results just of the Black Muslim participants. right? And we must remember that this was, this survey took place during Ramadan, right? And through Eid al-Fitr, right? So between May 6th and June 11th, we collected this data, and Ramadan was between April 24th and May 24th. So we measured perceived stress, optimism, self-rated health status, and also open-ended questions, right? How are you coping? How is this impacting your work experience? So we had about 311 Muslim participants, and overwhelmingly female, identified as female. And this is something that we also found to be true of our Christian participants, overwhelmingly female, but we were able to capture some of the experience of those who identified as African-American men as well. The average age, about 39, 40, with a range between 17 and 82. So we were able to get just really, again, a snapshot of an understanding of how both young folks are experiencing the pandemic, along with the other social toxins, and also some of our elders as well. So I'm going to give a little bit more detailed information about who these Black Muslim participants were, and then also what we found. So again, one thing that is important to note is that within the Black African American community, those who identify as Muslims also identify, you know, across the spectrum of ethnicity and language, and so we wanted to also make sure and do a really good job of capturing that diversity as well. So about 66% of our Black Muslim participants were identified as Black American, but they're also Black African, Caribbean, Afro-Latinx, Afro-Arab, and then those who identified as multi-ethnic. We were able to also ask questions about religious affiliation. So of those who were Muslim, the overwhelming majority identified as Sunni Muslim. But again, we wanted to capture just the richness of the diversity, religious and ethnic diversity of the Black Muslim community. And we were able to do that here. About 60% of the participants were born into a Muslim family, and then about 39% were converts to Islam. The overwhelming majority, 94%, identified as straight or heterosexual, and about half were married, 40% single, never married, and 10% divorced. One thing that I will say about how we tried to capture this sort of demographic information was simply to ask people, what is your racial or ethnic background, right? So we gave options, but we also put in there, right? How do you identify? What words, what language would you use to describe yourself? And that was also incredibly rich. That, you know, often we have, you know, this one flat category, Black, but that also includes East African, West African, Caribbean, those who are descendant of enslaved Africans in the US. And we wanted to make sure that people feel comfortable in being able to explain a little bit more about who they are. That's important. The most common states that our participants, our Black Muslim participants resided in was Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, California, Virginia, Georgia, Michigan, and North Carolina. Again, places that have large communities of Black Muslims. So this is not a surprise, but we are hoping that in subsequent research that we're also able to capture the experience of those that are in states where there aren't large Black Muslim communities. Of those who responded, about half were working full-time, but you know, this is, again, the concern is of those who were employed, almost 58% said that they would be considered an essential employee, right? And what we know to be true at this point, almost month 6 in the pandemic here in the US, is that it is the essential workers who are at most risk, right, or higher risk of infection and of death. They are also concerned about the potential or the possibility of becoming infected at work and then going back home to their families. And so this is to understand the stressors and the impact, right, of just employment and the types of employment Black Muslims are engaged in. Just within the pandemic, about 10% had also been laid off due to COVID. And so if we see about 47% were employed, that means about half of our participants were not. Of those who responded to the survey, Black Muslims, about 83% said that they didn't have any symptoms, but 13% had symptoms but were not formally tested, and about 2% had been diagnosed with COVID and recovered. One thing it's important to point out about the second, right, that had symptoms but not formally tested, again, may be indicative of what's happening in other minority communities, right? That there may be symptoms, there may be infection, but access to testing has been difficult. We also wanted to understand how people are coping psychologically, emotionally, and about 50% reported that they had been in counseling before, and about 14% currently in therapy, and 13% looking, right, searching for a competent therapist. The impact on religious practice, again, this data was collected during Ramadan and over Eid. What we saw was ways that folks were trying to cope, right? Either shifting their practice, many said it increased their sense of worship or acts of worship because they were home. For others, it was a time of loneliness, of actually having sort of a decreased sense of connection and spiritual connection. And for those, for some, it was just, not being able to understand, what do we do now, right? There's no congregational worship. We are not allowed to gather safely. We're not allowed to gather safely in large numbers. And so how does that even impact the communal experience of faith? Of those who responded, 49%, right, half of the Black Muslims who responded had friends or family members who had recovered from COVID, right? 29% had friends or family members with symptoms but hadn't been tested. And 28% had friends or family members who had died of COVID. So this means, right, again, I think sometimes the numbers can be very impersonal, can seem very sterile, but what this means is that for each person who responded to this survey, they themselves knew almost 3 people who had died, right? So think about, again, the emotional impact, right, of experiencing grief, of loss, perhaps being an essential worker, being someone who is tasked with the responsibility of caring for sick family members, maybe educating children at home. This is, again, a monumental task and is very heavy, is very overwhelming. And the conversation around the impact, right, has to include this particular experience. So the numbers tell one story, but we also ask questions so that we can hear directly from those who are experiencing in their own words. So I want to share just a few of those reflections from Black Muslims who responded to the survey. This 21-year-old African-American man said, "I have been extremely demoralized lately to have witnessed a significant uptick in police brutality, white supremacy, and utter disregard of Black and brown people and communities amidst the pandemic. Feeling like whatever we do, there is a permanent target on our backs for merely existing." Again, this 21-year-old African-American man identifies several social toxins, right? So this is not just about what's happening during COVID, but about all of the other sort of stressors in his life as well. This 72-year-old African-American woman said, "I'm tired of being labeled most likely to die first because I am poor, Black, and elderly." This 38-year-old Sudanese woman said, "I have surges of anxiety. The disparities Black folks are experiencing in infection, testing, and treatment have reinforced the general anti-Blackness of this country. This 42-year-old Black woman shared, "My husband is a first responder, so I'm always concerned about his well-being, praying that he stays safe and that he doesn't accidentally bring home anything to us. I have a 5-year-old son, and I'm dealing with his emotional changes because he misses school, friends, family, and going to the park. He had a breakdown for a week, and I felt a bit helpless." This 52-year-old African-American man said, "Each day is a universe. There's no normal day, no normal routine." And I'm quite sure that that resonates with many of us, right? Time just feels very distorted. You know, our sort of typical activities have been disrupted for quite some time. And so trying to understand, how do I ground myself, right? When time seems like either a week feels like a day, or each day feels like a universe. This 51-year-old African-American man said, "As a Muslim, and with Ramadan observance in the midst of COVID-19, life is more peaceful. It helps and redirects my focus away from the news and the images of death." And finally, this reflection from a 29-year-old East African woman, again, reading her words was very impactful for me. And I think, again, captures some of the experience, both of the hope and the despair. She said, "I'm doing my best to hold on to the light of faith. I've had a lot of dark days and have had difficulty coping. I can't sleep at night. My mind is always racing, thinking about how brief this life is. Black death is prevalent. Still, Black abuses have escalated, and to be forced to stay home and not be able to do anything to fight back has made coping with this pandemic a heart-wrenching one. I am more angry than ever. I find myself moving towards feelings of apathy. And this is terrifying consequence of this pandemic, to be indifferent about what is happening all over the globe in an effort to protect my sanity. This would be to sacrifice the softness of my heart. But every day it feels like an inch closer to despair. To be Black in this time is to be beaten to a pulp with just enough life to keep our blood flowing. I don't know how much more I can take." All this to say, overall, I'm coping terribly. So I'm going to take a deep breath because reading those words, and also, again, understanding that many who responded to the survey had lost loved ones to COVID, are thinking about police brutality, are thinking about anti-Blackness, are thinking about life and death, right? In the midst of everything that's happening, still holding on to faith, looking to worship and spiritual practice as a source of nourishment, of sustenance. What many different research has found is that African Americans generally, of all faiths, report higher religiosity, right? Often as a way of coping, but that race and faith are interconnected, are woven together. And so when we don't understand what this means for Black Muslims, we're doing a disservice, right, to understanding really the needs and the concerns of the African American community at large, and to also what this means in terms of us being members, right, of the broader society. The recommendations that I have are not exhaustive, again. They are just some thoughts that I think we need to consider as we move forward, because those toxins exist. You've heard it from the mouths directly of Black Muslims, of the despair, of this feeling of how brief life is, of being beaten down by these toxins, by this violence, but also looking to faith, right? Looking to understand suffering, looking to understand that God doesn't place a burden on you greater than you can bear, right? God doesn't do that. White supremacy puts a burden on us, right? That is not God's doing. And so it is up to not just Black Muslims to fight the injustice that we face, but for everyone. It impacts every single person, but it impacts Black Muslims directly. And if we're seeing this kind of disparity, right? Again, what the research lab shows, was that if Black Americans were dying at the same rate as white Americans, there would be 20,000 more Black Americans alive today, right? So what are the recommendations? Again, not an exhaustive list. We could probably spend another hour talking about some recommendations, but very briefly, thinking about mutual aid and recovery assistance, that this should go directly to those Black Muslim communities that are facing, again, the toxins which were present prior to COVID, and they are exacerbated now. So this is understanding, how do we fund, right, support for those who are experiencing grief and loss? How do we fund programs that can help with addressing the racial trauma, right? Witnessing violence almost every day, right? The impact it has psychologically. Are we devoting enough resources, tangible resources, so that people have opportunities, greater opportunities for healing? We have to support Black Muslim leadership, those who are at the front lines, who are serving communities, often overwhelmed, right, kind of stretched beyond capacity, but trying to figure out what is the best way forward, right, with my community, not just for people, but with people, what is the best way forward? Those relief efforts that are sort of geared towards the African-American community at large must include Muslims, right? That we have to challenge Christian hegemony. And so if we make statements like, oh, we're going to partner with the Black church, we also have to partner with the mosques in those Black communities as well. We have to raise awareness about voter suppression and political disenfranchisement. What is happening now, we have an election in November, right? Just a few months away. And this is what we have to be engaged about, right? We are also in a census year. Are we being counted? Are we voting, right? Are we running for local office, right? So that we can, as folks who are directly impacted by these toxins, by this violence, can begin to enact legislation to change it. Defunding the police, and allocating those funds to nonprofits, behavioral health, and social service organizations that, again, are attempting to meet the needs of not just Black Muslims, but African Americans in general, right? And being able to reduce some of those toxins that people are enduring in order to thrive, right? Not just to sort of survive another day, but to really think about, how does a community grow and thrive and build, right, under these levels of oppression. And lastly, increasing funding to Black Muslim organizations that are focused on anti-racism and social justice, so that we're addressing anti-Blackness within the Muslim community, that we're addressing anti-Blackness and its implications in broader society. So organizations like Black Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, Muslim ARC, that has been doing work for years to raise, again, consciousness around anti-Blackness within the Muslim community, but also other organizations, many of whom are led by Black Muslim women, like Muslim Wellness Foundation, my organization, thinking about Sapelo Square, which is an online platform for Black Muslims in the US. And so when we're increasing representation, when we're listening to those who are directly impacted, when we're funding organizations that are seeking to address and reduce, right, the level of trauma and violence that these communities are experiencing, we have to support them both in word and in deed with our pockets, so that these efforts are sustainable, that once we have sort of shifted away from perhaps this immediate crisis, that we can understand that there are going to be chronic implications, that Black Muslims will be having to navigate chronic stressors, right? What is the long-term implication of disproportionate death in our community, understanding the economic impact, the educational implications? These are all things that will need to be supported, not just within these first 6 to 12 months, but in years to come. So if there are any questions, I'll turn it back over to the moderators. Thank you all for listening and for being attentive. I pray, inshallah, that this information was useful. If there were any errors, they are all mine. If there's any benefit, alhamdulillah, all praise due to Allah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Kameelah, for this wonderful presentation. I think it was quite dense, both in terms of its knowledge and emotion for all of us. So again, as you'll see in the chat, Ashanur has posted our guidelines for the Q&A session. If you have any questions for Dr. Kameelah Rashad, please either use the raise hand option and so I can call on you and we can unmute you, or if you would like to post your questions in the chat box, please, of course, feel free to do so. We have about 15-20 minutes or so for the Q&A session, and if I may start with one question using my role as a moderator. Kameelah, thank you so much. I mean, and I think the introduction that you have given to us was quite useful, especially around the invisibility of Black Muslims. And an equal sort of, I think, an important question has been the conversation within the Black community at large itself, both Christian, Muslim, and non-Muslim Black community. Could you expand on that a little bit? To what extent do you see that dynamic come and impact even the dynamics within the broader Muslim community, and to what extent that informs the experiences around COVID-19? I mean, one experience that I can remember or refer to is like in Philadelphia, the Black COVID doctors and their testing stations, have straddled between mosques and churches. With the COVID sort of, with the pandemic, has it created any sort of bridging of some of that gap that you have referred?
Well, the advocating sort of behind the scenes, what you mentioned was the Philadelphia Black Doctors Coalition that was doing free testing, providing free testing in Philadelphia area, originally had only partnered with churches. And it was, through some advocacy through the National Black Muslim COVID Coalition, to say this is, what is also needed for Muslims as well. But I think what becomes challenging and exhausting, right, for Black Muslims is being able to, within the African American or Black community, talk about that Christian privilege and hegemony, so that African American is not synonymous with Christian, right? There's a significant majority, but there has always been religious diversity within the community as well. And so it's being able to have conversations about how Black Muslims are excluded when we're talking about specifically allocating either funding or support for African Americans. And then on the side, the American Muslim side, if we're only focused on either lifting up stories of, sort of Muslim doctors, right, who are, challenged by, working within the pandemic, but almost half of the participants in our study identified as essential workers, right? So this could be those who, are employed by public transit. They could be home health aides, grocery store workers. They could also be doctors, right? But there's such a range. And I think there are times when, as American Muslims, right, when we're lifting up kind of the stories, it is of these, extraordinary, kind of moments. But I think it is extraordinary the way that Black Muslims are able to kind of cope and remain resilient, right, in the face of all of these toxins.
Thank you so much for that and for that context and that background to the coalition's work. I wanted to highlight, because I know it might be difficult as the presenter to keep an eye on the chat, two of the leading academics from our field, Professor Deborah Majid and Professor Zain Kassam, both are sending their congratulations and putting down their praise for your work. One sort of quick sort of follow-up question, at least from me, in the meantime, is I know that you've focused mostly on the Muslim participants from the survey. So what are some maybe parallels or differences that the research has identified in terms of differences between the Muslim and the non-Muslim participants in the survey? If you can give us some glimpses of that.
I'm muted. Okay. What I think is actually very fascinating is that we were able to capture almost comparable numbers of Black Muslims and Black Christians to do that faith comparison. And so there was also similar experiences. But what we found was that there was much more expressed sort of spiritual coping. And again, that might be a timing issue, that we were in the middle of Ramadan. And for many, it felt like a reprieve, right? That although we couldn't worship and kind of be together in the way that we normally would, that it helped us sort of like ground ourselves, to give order to a day, to focus on worship and in a different ways, right? Within the context of family. And so many of our participants mentioned Ramadan as like an anchor, right, of being able to sort of, and as I shared, one African-American man saying, you know, just having Ramadan and fasting, right, as a way to shift the focus away from death, honestly. So that was one of the significant differences that we found.
Sorry, now I was muted. I am looking in the chat for any hands raised, and I'll encourage that. Looking at the data, Dr. Rashida, one of the points that you've identified in terms of the demographic from the Muslim participants is 60% were born into, about 60% into Muslim families, about 40% were converts. Are there anything that stood out between the experiences of born and convert members in terms of spiritual coping, in terms of what communal places being closed means for their experiences? I know that there are only limited things that you can measure in these surveys, so maybe that wasn't something, but I was curious about that.
So we still have a lot of data that we're analyzing, and so we want to disseminate that as soon as possible. There were some differences in terms of optimism and coping. The one thing that I didn't mention was almost half of our Black Muslim participants also reported that they had a pre-existing health condition. And so that was, you know, that was very significant. And so we're looking at those who both had reported that they had recovered from COVID or had lost someone, with coping, with seeking services. So we're doing that analysis now, and we're kind of excited to share what we find.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, thank you for that. This was a question that I was going to bring a little bit later, but I want to ask now. So every year, Muslim Wellness Foundation organizes the Black Muslim Psychology Conference. And of course, this year the gathering could not happen. And in the past 2 years that I've been able to attend, I benefited immensely from it. So I was wondering if in the research, so one question was going to be if you could reflect on the fact that you couldn't bring that gathering, that conference, which brings together academics, which bring together everyday community members, activists, religious leaders, and many others. What does that mean or meant for you and your work? But at the same time, a related question is whether you've been able to measure, and I apologize if I missed that, access to mental health among your participants, whether that stands, whether you see any trends over there.
Yeah, so to your first question about the Black Muslim Psychology Conference, I was heartbroken that we couldn't gather together, but it's been postponed till next July, inshallah. And so what it has pushed us to do is to think about how we can organize virtual spaces that allow for that kind of connection, right? If so much of our lives, I know people are kind of zoomed out at this point, you know, we need to take breaks from the screen, but it's really, I think, first beginning with Ramadan, really forcing us to think about, especially for those who, for whatever reason, do not have a community around them, right, have made use of sort of like virtual spaces. And so how can we sort of leverage that to create community in a different way, right? It won't be the same as in person, but it allows for the connection and reducing the isolation, which does exacerbate anxiety and depression. Of those who responded, I think about 13% just stated that they were looking for, currently looking for counseling, and about an equal number, if not a few percentage more, were in therapy, right, at the time that they responded to the survey. So what this also, again, is challenging us to do, and this is part that is directly in line with my work. One is to, we're gathering information to create a directory of Black Muslim mental health professionals, whether they're clinicians or researchers, but also thinking about how do we increase the competence of those who do not identify as Black and Muslim, to open up the opportunities for people to see a qualified mental health professional. For many Black Muslims that I've worked with, and those who are seeking therapy, it is the intersection and the social toxins that they often express is not addressed appropriately, right? So what does it mean for me to be Black and Muslim? What does it mean for me to both be marginalized to some degree within the American Muslim community and then within the African American community? So there's a level of complexity there. And people are looking for someone who is either a Black Muslim or has, you know, a healthy respect and knowledge of the needs and concerns of Black Muslims. So we're actively, right, searching for those who want to be sort of trained around competence in this area, but also can provide services. Oh,
Sorry. Yeah, I was saying thank you for that, and then so that access continues to be limited, and that comes out in the data, or
that we don't know. Those, right. Some of the open-ended questions allowed for people to talk a little bit more about how they're overall coping. But you know, inshallah, we would love to do a follow-up to this survey to see what has changed, what is similar, and you know, unfortunately, what might have worsened since May or June when we collected the data.
So absolutely. In the meantime, what I will do is I'm going to post both the links for the Muslim Wellness Foundation and the Black Muslim COVID Coalition in the chat for our audience to hopefully visit those websites. Okay, I'm looking for one more question. One of the issues that you have highlighted, Dr. Kameelah, is the anti-Black racism within the broader American Muslim community or American Ummah, and that's sort of borrowing from anti-Black racism within the broader American community. So in challenges to this, you know, one of the perspectives from some perhaps those who might want to prioritize sort of, you know, the economic, you know, resources is that, you know, the experiences of working class individuals during COVID-19 being an equalizer, or so to speak, that, you know, the essential workers. So to that argument, right, you know, what are your responses? That is that, you know, whether really, you know, the economic, you know, belonging to same economic class, you know, dissipates that racial lines that are so dominance in the American community. That that's something that sometimes white supremacists, of course, bring to the fore, sometimes from within the American Muslim community or the broader Black community too. You might hear discourses like that, and I'm asking that question in part in relationship to this issue that also came up in our webinar before, which was that the discourses from within the Black Muslim community that sort of approach this pandemic with a skepticism that partly borrowed from skepticism towards the medical field from within the American Black Muslim community and the broader Black community. So I guess I think it might be helpful to do it in two parts. So one is that argument around economic class being a dominant explanatory sort of platform. What would you say to that?
I think even race, class, religion, gender is always intertwined. And so I'm baffled by people that kind of want to pull it apart when I am always a Black Muslim woman. And so when people are trying to, kind of focus on exclusively one aspect of someone's identity, there's so much that's missed. When people say that in some ways COVID has been an equalizer, I would say that is false, right? Because the assumption is that we have all started, right, at the same level of vulnerability and of resources. And that is not the case. And so when we're looking at a disproportionate impact on Black Americans, which include Muslims, right, it means that those who were already sort of teetering, right, or vulnerable in this pandemic, we have to think about what might be coming up with evictions, with unemployment, with folks trying to educate their children, but then not being able to go back to work. If you're at a higher risk of infection, that might also kind of put you in quarantine for 2 weeks and then not being able to work. So there's already so much risk before COVID, right? And so now this is exacerbated. If we were all starting kind of at the same place, right, then we can kind of use that metric, but in this case we cannot. And your second question.
Yeah, no, it's the second question. I'll come, but I think it's also helpful to remind everyone that data that you shared, about 20,000 Blacks in America would be alive if the death rate was the same as white Americans. So the second question is something that we also discussed with Donna Austin during her webinar in this series, which was the skepticism from within the Black Muslim community towards the pandemic, sometimes the medical recommendations and all, and that complex history of mistrust to the medical society, but at the same time its reverse impact on the community itself. Did you see anything in your?
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about, again, so thinking about the social toxins, right, which include incarceration, detention, monitoring, surveillance of Black Muslims, health disparities, again, pre-existing, right, before COVID. And when we talk about vaccinations, contact tracing, right, the same technology that's used to surveil communities are in fact being used, right, to conduct this contact tracing. A lot of people are skeptical, right, because how could that information be used, right? So if one, say, Black Muslim in a community is subject to that contact tracing, it could also provide information for perhaps law enforcement to map an entire community, right? Suspicionless surveillance. And with the history of medical apartheid, of scientific racism, people are very reluctant, right, to say, okay, I'll agree to a vaccination, right? We know for a fact that our communities have been used, right, to study disease and to be infected on purpose. And so when there's reluctance or wariness or distrust, I think that has to be taken into consideration. And what has helped with the Black Muslim COVID Coalition is to have Black Muslim experts, right, who can acknowledge, right, why that distrust is there, and then also provide accurate information to community members to kind of allay some of their fears, right, legitimate fears and concerns related to the disease.
Thank you so much for that, and I have attended, some of the webinars. It was wonderful information that was shared in those sessions. So I'll encourage everyone to remain on the mailing lists of both institutions to be aware of those links. So we have come to the end of our session. We wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Kameelah, Rashad, for your wonderful presentation, for this research, for this survey. We hope that it impacts both research that academics like us will comment on the community benefit from this, and then at large the community does so as well. You'll see that my colleague Aisha Nursen-Maskar is posting a number of links to the center, the Maidan, and the mailing list. Please make sure to subscribe if you haven't to those, so that you can receive the link for the recording, hopefully when it becomes available soon. And I want to also remind you all of our next session on September 8th with Gary Bond's a talk centered around his recent book, #Islam, will be our series. The series will continue into December, and we are finalizing the program for October, November, and December, which will be on the website soon as well. We wanted to thank again Dr. Rashad, and she has just kindly posted her email address here, Kameelah@muslimwellness.com. Feel free to reach out to her. Dr. Kameelah, Rashad, thank you so much again for giving us your valuable time, for sharing this. Thank you so much to everyone who were able to join us this afternoon. We very much hope to remain in touch and see you in our next programs. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Ahmed Salim. Thank you very much, Dr. Rashad.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for all your help.